The Blood Moon, written by Nini Peters. Rain hammered the warehouse windows like machine gun fire, each drop echoing through the cavernous space where Aaron stood over what was left of 23 innocent people. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the kind of rage that made grown men piss themselves and sent lesser wolves whimpering for cover. At 6'5" with shoulders that could block out the sun, Aaron Blackstone was built like a freight train and twice as dangerous when something pissed him off. Right now, he was beyond pissed. 23 bodies. 23 people who'd trusted his pack to keep them safe from the monsters that crawled out of the darkness looking for easy prey. All of them drained dry, neat little puncture wounds on their necks like some sick vampire's idea of fine dining. The metallic stench of blood mixed with something else. Something that made his wolf pace like a caged animal inside his chest, restless and angry and wanted to tear something apart with its teeth. Fucking bloodsuckers are getting bold, Derek muttered, stepping over a body that used to be someone's daughter. Maybe she'd had dreams, plans for the weekend, a boyfriend who was probably wondering why she wasn't answering her phone. Now she was just another corpse in a vampire's feeding frenzy, another failure that would haunt Aaron's dreams for months to come. Derek had been his beta since they were kids, back when Aaron's biggest worry was whether he'd grow into his oversized paws. Now Derek's job was keeping Aaron from doing something stupid when his temper got the better of him. Tonight, that was looking like a tall order. Aaron's jaw clenched so hard he heard his teeth crack. His pack had one job: keep the humans safe from the monsters that went bump in the night. For 300 years, his family had held the line between innocent people and the vampires who saw them as nothing more than walking blood bags. It was a simple arrangement. Vampires hunt humans, werewolves hunt vampires. Everybody knows where they stand. The natural order, his father had called it. Predator and protector, locked in eternal conflict until one side or the other finally won. Except tonight felt different. Tonight, the air itself seemed to buzz with possibility, like the moment before lightning strikes, when every hair on your body stands up and you know something big is coming whether you're ready or not. Aaron could feel it in his bones, a humming tension that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin, sensing change on the horizon like the approach of a massive storm that would either wash the world clean or destroy everything in its path. The pack had sacred laws that had governed their kind for millennia, rules carved into their souls by generations of ancestors who had died defending the mortal world from supernatural predators. Protect the innocent, hunt the undead, show no mercy to those who prey upon humans. These weren't just guidelines. They were the very foundation of werewolf society, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. Break those laws, and you weren't just betraying your pack. You were betraying every werewolf who had ever lived and died for the cause. But as Aaron stood there staring at the carnage, something nagged at him. Something about the way the bodies were arranged, the precision of the kills, the almost surgical nature of the wounds. This wasn't random feeding. This was a message. A declaration of war written in innocent blood and designed to provoke exactly the kind of response his wolf was demanding. The question was why? What did the vampires gain by starting a fight they couldn't win? Marcus is gathering the others, Derek said, his voice cutting through Aaron's thoughts. We can have 40 wolves ready to hunt within the hour. Track these bastards down and show them what happens when they mess with our territory. Aaron nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. In all his years as alpha, he'd never seen vampires act this boldly, this recklessly. They were creatures of shadow and subtlety, preferring to hunt alone and cover their tracks. Mass killings like this were bad for business, drew too much attention from both human authorities and werewolf packs. So why risk it? Double the patrols, he said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had kept his pack strong and unified for a decade. I want teams covering every district, every neighborhood where humans might be vulnerable. And Derek, his beta looked up, waiting. Tell Marcus to keep the younger wolves in check. I don't want anyone going off half-cocked, looking for revenge. We do this smart, or we don't do it all. Derek nodded and headed for the door, leaving Aaron alone with the dead and his own troubled thoughts. Something was building in the supernatural world, something that made his instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite understand. And somewhere out there, whoever was responsible for this massacre was probably watching and waiting to see how he'd respond. Across the city, in the opulent penthouse that served as the court of the Eastern Vampire Collective, Jane Nightfall stood before floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering metropolis spread out below her like a banquet of mortal lives. Her reflection in the glass was all sharp angles and dangerous curves, the kind of woman who could stop traffic with a smile and start wars with a frown. At 900 years old, she'd seen empires rise and fall, had watched the world change from horseback to helicopters, and through it all, she'd survived by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than anything that tried to take her down. Raven black hair that fell past her waist caught the city lights like liquid silk, and her skin was so pale it practically glowed in the moonlight. But it was her eyes that marked her as something otherworldly, the color of fresh blood, ancient and knowing, missing absolutely nothing that happened in her domain. She was beautiful in the way that avalanches were beautiful, magnificent, unstoppable, and absolutely devastating to anything that stood in her path. Those eyes were currently fixed on the chaos unfolding 30 stories below, where police sirens wailed and emergency lights painted the streets in shades of red and blue. She could smell the blood from here, could sense the fear and confusion radiating from the humans who had stumbled across Victor's handiwork. Her jaw tightened with barely controlled fury as she calculated the damage this would do to the careful balance she'd spent decades building. "My queen," Victor's voice cut through her thoughts like nails on a chalkboard, and Jane had to resist the urge to put her fist through the reinforced glass in front of her. She didn't turn around, didn't need to. She could smell his satisfaction from across the room, could practically hear the smug grin in his voice. Victor Ashworth was her lieutenant, supposedly her most trusted advisor, and right now he was about as useful as tits on a bull and twice as annoying. Explain. One word. That's all Jane gave him, but it carried enough ice to freeze hell over. She learned a long time ago that the fewer words you used, the more people paid attention to the ones you did. Economy of language was a tool, just like fangs and claws, and the supernatural charisma that made even ancient vampires drop to their knees in her presence. The humans were getting comfortable, Victor said, his British accent making everything sound civilized even when he was describing mass murder. Walking around at night like they owned the place, forgetting their proper position in the food chain. I thought it was time for a reminder about who really runs this city. His tone was casual, dismissive, like he was discussing the weather instead of the slaughter of 23 innocent people. Jane's fingers tightened on the balcony railing hard enough to crack the reinforced concrete, and she heard Victor take an involuntary step back as the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. She'd been running vampires long enough to recognize bloodlust dressed up in fancy words, had dealt with enough ambitious lieutenants to know the difference between strategic thinking and simple sadism. Victor wasn't interested in maintaining their carefully constructed secret. He was interested in flexing his muscles and showing off for the younger vampires who still thought power meant leaving a trail of bodies in your wake. "You killed 23 people in one night," she said, still not turning around. Her voice was deadly quiet now, the kind of quiet that preceded very bad things happening to very stupid vampires. "In my territory, against my direct orders, in a location guaranteed to be discovered by human authorities within hours." Each word was measured, precise, carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated authority and the promise of consequences that would make exile look like a vacation. "What exactly did you think would happen when the wolves found that mess?" Now she did turn, and Victor took another step back when he saw her eyes. They weren't just red anymore. They were glowing like coals in a forge, and her fangs had descended just enough to catch the light. "Did you think Aaron Blackstone would just shrug it off? Send a strongly worded letter? File a complaint with the supernatural authorities?" The truth was, Jane had been hearing Aaron Blackstone's name for years, long before tonight's disaster had made their eventual confrontation inevitable. The Werewolf Alpha was a legend among both their peoples, a tactician who'd kept his pack strong and unified for a decade, a fighter who'd never lost a battle, a leader who inspired the kind of loyalty that made his wolves willing to die for him without question. She'd never met him face to face, but she'd studied his methods, learned his patterns, and developed what she privately called a professional appreciation for his abilities. What she hadn't expected was the weird flutter in her chest every time someone mentioned his name, or the way her mind wandered to wondering what he looked like when he was angry, whether his eyes really glowed gold like the survivors claimed. She definitely hadn't expected to find herself defending him to her own lieutenant, or feeling protective of a man she'd never met who was supposed to be her natural enemy. Jane had built her power base by being ruthless when necessary and diplomatic when possible, by understanding that sometimes the best way to win a war was to avoid fighting it in the first place. She'd spent decades carefully managing the relationship between her vampires and the human population, establishing feeding protocols that satisfied their nutritional needs without drawing unwanted attention. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance and occasionally brutal enforcement when someone stepped out of line. Victor waved a hand like he was brushing off a fly, his arrogance apparently rendering him immune to the danger signals radiating from his queen. "Let the mutts come," he said with a laugh that grated against Jane's nerves like fingernails on glass. "We fed well tonight. We're strong, and they're just animals pretending to be human. When have werewolves ever been anything more than overgrown dogs with delusions of grandeur?" The backhand that sent Victor sprawling across her marble floor happened so fast, even vampire reflexes couldn't track it. 1 second he was standing there looking smug. The next he was on his ass with claw marks healing on his cheek, and fear finally replacing the arrogance in his ice-blue eyes. When he looked up at her from his undignified position on the floor, Jane was standing over him with her fangs fully extended and power radiating off her like heat from a forge. "You forget yourself," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had made ancient vampires kneel before her for centuries. "I am your queen, not your drinking companion. You follow my orders, or you find yourself exiled to hunt rats in whatever gutter will have you." The threat wasn't idle. Jane had made examples of rebellious lieutenants before, and the supernatural community had long memories when it came to the fates of those who crossed her. Victor scrambled to his feet, all pretense of casual insolence replaced by genuine alarm. In all his centuries of existence, he had never seen Jane lose control like this, had never witnessed the raw power that she kept carefully leashed beneath her regal exterior. "Of course, my queen," he said, bowing deeper than strict protocol required. "I meant no disrespect. You were merely demonstrating why you'll never be anything more than a lieutenant." Jane cut him off, her voice returning to its usual tone of absolute control. "Now get out of my sight before I decide that exile is too good for you." As Victor hurried to obey, practically tripping over himself in his haste to escape her presence, Jane returned to her position at the windows, staring out at the city that had been her domain for over 2 centuries. She could feel something building in the supernatural currents that flowed beneath the surface of the mortal world, ancient powers stirring like leviathans in the deep. The old prophecies whispered in languages that predated human civilization, speaking of blood moons and unlikely alliances, of love conquering hatred and enemies becoming more than friends. Jane had always dismissed such nonsense as the romantic fantasies of vampires who'd lived too long and seen too much, stories told to comfort the weak and give hope to the hopeless. But tonight, with Victor's blood still staining her knuckles and the scent of human death drifting up from the streets below, she found herself remembering her grandmother's words from centuries past. The old vampire had been ancient even then, one of the first of their kind to walk the earth, and she'd spoken of a time when the natural order would shift, when the children of the night would have to choose between evolution and extinction. "The wolf shall love what he's sworn to hate," her grandmother had said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy and the certainty of fate. "The dead shall choose a living fate, and when their hearts beat as one, the war of ages shall be done." At the time, Jane had thought it was poetry, the romantic ramblings of an old creature who'd forgotten the brutal realities of survival in a world that wanted them all dead. Now, as she stood alone in her penthouse palace, she wasn't so sure. Because somewhere out there, Aaron Blackstone was probably preparing for war, gathering his pack, and planning their response to tonight's massacre. And despite everything logic and tradition told her about their inevitable conflict, Jane found herself hoping that when they finally met, it would be as something other than enemies. The thought was treasonous, dangerous in ways that went beyond mere political considerations. Vampires and werewolves were natural enemies, locked in eternal conflict by their very natures. To even consider alliance with a werewolf pack was to betray everything she'd been taught, everything she'd fought for during 9 centuries of existence. But as Jane watched the lights of the city twinkle like stars below, she couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming whether she was ready for it or not. 3 nights later, everything changed. The abandoned subway station felt like a cathedral built for violence. All vaulted ceilings and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Gothic architecture from an era when people understood that some spaces were meant to inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Aaron had tracked the vampire scent through 20 miles of underground tunnels, following a trail that led deeper and deeper into the bowels of the city until he emerged into this forgotten piece of history. The place had been sealed off from human use for decades, which made it perfect for the kind of conversation that involved fangs and claws, and probably a lot of blood. He'd brought his best with him. Derek, of course, along with Marcus and Elena, Thomas and Sarah, and 6 others who'd proven themselves in enough fights to earn their place at his side when shit hit the fan. They moved through the station like liquid death, their enhanced senses cataloging every shadow, every scent, every sound that might mean the difference between going home to their families and becoming vampire food in a forgotten tunnel beneath the city. The air was thick with the smell of decay and old water, rust and rat droppings, and the accumulated grime of decades of abandonment. But underneath it all, Aaron could detect something else, a scent that made his wolf sit up and take notice with an intensity that bordered on obsession. It was sophisticated, complex, layering night-blooming jasmine with something indefinably feminine and powerfully supernatural. It was also completely unlike anything he'd been taught to expect from vampires, who were supposed to smell like death and decay and all the things that belonged in graves. When they reached the main platform, Aaron realized they weren't the hunters anymore. They were walking into a trap, and whoever had said it was good enough to make him respect their tactical abilities even as he prepared to fight for his life. Jane Nightfall stood in the center of the space like a queen holding court, surrounded by 10 of her most trusted vampires and radiating power that made the air itself shimmer with supernatural energy. She positioned herself perfectly, elevated above the tunnel entrances, multiple escape routes, clear lines of sight in every direction. It was the work of a tactical mind that understood terrain and positioning, the calculations of someone who'd survived 9 centuries by never leaving anything to chance and always planning 3 moves ahead of her enemies. But it was Jane herself that stopped Aaron dead in his tracks, his wolf going completely silent for the first time in his adult life, as every instinct he possessed focused on the creature before him with laser-like intensity. She was nothing like what he'd expected. He'd come here ready to face a monster, some ancient creature that fed on innocent people without conscience or remorse, a predator who saw humans as nothing more than prey to be hunted and consumed. Instead, he was looking at the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and that realization hit him like a freight train to the chest, leaving him struggling to breathe and think and remember why he was supposed to hate her. Black leather hugged every dangerous curve of her body, emphasizing the lethal grace with which she moved and the power that radiated from her frame like heat from a forge. Her dark hair flowed around her shoulders like liquid silk, catching the emergency lighting and seeming to glow with its own inner fire. But it was her eyes that truly captured his attention, blood-red and ancient, holding depths of knowledge and experience that spoke of centuries of existence and all the secrets that came with immortality. This was wrong. This was all kinds of fucked up in ways that made his head spin and his heart race. She was Vampire, the enemy, the thing he'd been raised to hunt and kill without hesitation or remorse. She was supposed to be a monster, not this magnificent creature who made his pulse race and his hands itch to touch and his wolf whimper with something that definitely wasn't hatred. Alpha. Her voice carried across the space between them like honey and promises, and sent all wrapped up in that slight accent that spoke of old countries and older secrets. Each syllable was perfectly enunciated, carrying nuances of emotion that suggested depths of feeling that should have been impossible for an undead creature. I was wondering when you'd show up. Aaron's throat felt like sandpaper, but he managed to get words out anyway. Vampire. It came out rougher than he'd intended, like he'd been drinking gravel and washing it down with broken glass. And he saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been amusement or appreciation or something else entirely that he wasn't ready to identify. The moment their gazes locked, something electric shot between them, a jolt of recognition that made absolutely no sense and scared the hell out of both of them. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, the ancient hatred that defined their species seemed to just evaporate, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous and completely terrifying in its implications. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing not your reflection, but your other half, the missing piece you hadn't even known you were searching for until the moment you found it. Neither of them was prepared for the intensity of the connection, for the way it seemed to bypass all rational thought and speak directly to parts of themselves they'd kept carefully buried for years. Aaron felt his wolf respond to her presence with something that wasn't aggression or territorial instinct but recognition, like a long-lost pack member finally coming home. Jane felt her undead heart attempt to beat for the first time in centuries, a sensation so foreign and overwhelming that she had to fight not to stumble backward in shock. "Your people have been busy," Aaron managed, taking a step closer despite every survival instinct screaming at him to keep his distance. Around him, his pack spread out in formation, but Aaron couldn't look away from Jane's face, couldn't break whatever spell was weaving itself between them with threads of attraction and possibility and something that felt disturbingly like destiny. "Some of my people," Jane corrected, and her voice carried a tremor she hoped he wouldn't notice. The admission was like a slap to everything Aaron thought he knew about vampires. They were supposed to be mindless predators, creatures driven by bloodlust and incapable of higher thought or moral consideration. But the woman standing before him spoke of control and responsibility, of leadership that went beyond simple dominance and extended into areas he'd never imagined vampires capable of exploring. "Acting without my knowledge or permission," she continued, taking her own step closer. The movement brought her near enough that Aaron could catch her scent properly for the first time, and what he smelled nearly sent his wolf into a frenzy of confusion and desire. She didn't smell like death or decay or any of the things his father had told him to expect from vampires. Instead, she carried the fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and rain-washed stone, of ancient magic, and something indefinably feminine that made every cell in his body stand at attention. "I don't make a habit of condoning mass murder, Alpha," Jane said, her blood-red eyes never leaving his as the space between them continued to shrink. "Contrary to what you may believe, not all vampires are mindless predators who see humans as nothing more than prey to be hunted." The words should have been dismissed as lies or manipulation, the kind of thing a clever enemy might say to lower his guard before striking. But Aaron could hear the sincerity in her voice, could see the genuine regret in her expression when she spoke of the 23 dead humans. This wasn't the remorseless monster his father had described in stories meant to teach young wolves about their enemies. This was someone who felt the weight of responsibility for actions taken by those under her command, someone who understood the difference between necessary feeding and senseless slaughter. "Then why are we here?" he asked, close enough now to see the flecks of gold in her crimson eyes, to feel the supernatural energy that surrounded her like a second skin. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows across her face, highlighting the elegant bone structure that spoke of aristocratic breeding and the predatory grace that marked her as a creature built for hunting. Because Victor Ashworth defied my direct orders and created a problem that threatens both our peoples, Jane replied, her voice dropping to a level that forced him to lean closer to hear properly. The movement brought them within arm's reach of each other, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could catch his scent of pine forests and thunderstorms and raw masculine power that made her undead heart try to remember how to beat. And because she continued, her voice becoming barely a whisper that somehow carried to every supernatural ear in the chamber. I think it's time our peoples stopped defining themselves by ancient hatred and started considering what a different future might look like. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Aaron felt his entire worldview tilt sideways on its axis. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Vampires and werewolves were natural enemies, locked in eternal conflict by their very natures, driven by instincts that made cooperation impossible and peace a naive dream. They weren't supposed to stand in abandoned subway stations talking about different futures while looking at each other like they were seeing something miraculous. But that's exactly what was happening, and neither of them seemed capable of stopping it. The attraction between them was magnetic, undeniable, pulling them together despite every law and tradition that said they should be trying to kill each other. Aaron found himself wondering what her skin would feel like under his hands, whether she would taste like the honey her voice promised, or something darker and more intoxicating. Jane caught herself imagining what it would be like to run her fingers through his dark hair, to feel those strong arms wrapped around her, to know what it was like to be held by someone who saw her as more than just a monster wearing a beautiful face. "You talk about responsibility," Aaron said, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos raging through his system. Every instinct he possessed was at war with itself. His wolf wanted to claim her as its mate, while his human mind reeled at the impossibility of the situation. But 23 people are dead. 23 innocents who trusted us to keep them safe from creatures like you. What kind of responsibility covers that? Jane's expression darkened, and for a moment Aaron caught a glimpse of the predator that lurked beneath all that regal beauty. But her anger wasn't directed at him. It was aimed squarely at Victor and the vampires who'd acted against her orders, who'd violated the careful balance she'd spent decades building between their peoples and the human world. "Victor Ashworth and his co-conspirators will face justice according to our laws," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "They'll be stripped of their positions, exiled from my territory, and marked as rogues. Any vampire who encounters them will be free to destroy them without consequence or punishment." The punishment was brutal by any standard, Aaron realized. For vampires, exile was essentially a death sentence, cutting them off from the protection and resources of their coven, leaving them vulnerable to hunters and rival factions who would show no mercy to rogues operating without sanction. That Jane was willing to impose such harsh consequences on her own people spoke volumes about her commitment to justice and her understanding of the delicate political balance that kept their secret world from exploding into open warfare. But Derek wasn't buying it. Aaron's beta had been listening to the exchange with growing skepticism, his hand resting on the silver knife at his belt and his body language radiating the kind of tension that preceded violence. "Pretty words," he said, stepping forward with the aggressive confidence of a wolf who'd fought and killed vampires before. "But words don't bring back the dead. Why should we trust anything a bloodsucker says? How do we know this isn't just another manipulation, another lie designed to lower our guard, so you can strike when we're not expecting it?" The insult hit the air like a physical blow, and several of Jane's vampires hissed and bared their fangs in response. The tension in the chamber ratcheted up several notches, teetering on the edge of violence that would leave most of them dead and accomplish nothing except adding to the body count that had brought them here in the first place. But Jane didn't react with anger or offense. Instead, she studied Derek with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she was genuinely considering his question and trying to find an answer that would satisfy his skepticism. Because, she said finally, reaching into her jacket with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. I'm prepared to offer more than words. The vial she withdrew was small and dark, filled with liquid that caught the emergency lighting and made it gleam like liquid rubies. Even from a distance, Aaron could smell the copper tang of blood, could sense the supernatural energy radiating from it like heat from a furnace. Victor's blood, Jane explained, holding up the vial so that everyone present could see it clearly. Freely given as part of his punishment, offered to you as proof of my sincerity. Use it to track him and his accomplices. Hunt them down and deliver whatever justice you see fit. I won't interfere, won't offer them sanctuary or assistance. They violated my laws and your people's safety. Let them face the consequences of their actions. The offer was unprecedented in the annals of supernatural history. Vampires didn't betray their own kind to werewolves, didn't hand over their people for execution by ancient enemies. The fact that Jane was willing to do exactly that spoke of either incredible desperation or genuine commitment to the principles she claimed to follow. Aaron stared at the vial for a long moment, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. With vampire blood, his pack could track Victor anywhere on the continent, could hunt him down with an efficiency that would make his punishment swift and certain. It was justice for the 23 innocents who died, vengeance served on a silver platter by the very leader of the vampires who'd killed them. But accepting the offer would also mean acknowledging Jane as a partner rather than an enemy, would represent a fundamental shift in the relationship between their species that could have consequences nobody was prepared for. It would mean admitting that not all vampires were irredeemable monsters, that cooperation between their kinds was not only possible, but potentially beneficial for everyone involved. There's more, Jane continued, apparently reading the conflict in his expression with the insight of someone who'd spent centuries learning to read people's faces and motivations. I propose a formal alliance between our peoples, a treaty that would establish clear boundaries and rules of engagement, protecting innocent humans while allowing both our species to coexist without the constant threat of warfare. The suggestion hit the chamber like a bomb going off, causing gasps and snarls from both sides as the implications sank in. Alliance between vampires and werewolves was the stuff of legend and prophecy, not practical politics. It went against everything both species had been taught about their relationship, violated traditions that had been established over millennia of conflict and bloodshed. But looking into Jane's eyes, Aaron could see that she was completely serious, that this wasn't some elaborate deception or manipulation designed to gain advantage in their eternal conflict. She truly believed that their peoples could find a way to coexist, could build something better than the endless cycle of violence and retribution that had defined their relationship since the dawn of time. And why, Aaron asked, his voice barely above a whisper, would you want such an alliance? What possible benefit could cooperation with werewolves offer to someone in your position? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with centuries of mutual distrust and the expectation that any vampire's answer would involve manipulation or hidden agendas designed to benefit only their own kind. Jane's smile was sad and beautiful and filled with longing that seemed to span centuries of existence. Because I'm tired of being a monster, she said simply, her voice carrying a vulnerability that cut through all his defenses like a blade. Because I've seen what our hatred has cost both our peoples, and I believe we're stronger together than we are apart. Because the world is changing, Aaron Blackstone, and we can either change with it or risk extinction when humanity finally develops the technology to hunt us all down and destroy us. She paused, her gaze dropping for just a moment before meeting his eyes again with blazing intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. And because the prophecies speak of a time when wolf and vampire will stand as one, when ancient enemies will become allies, when love will triumph over hatred to transform the very nature of our world. I've lived for 9 centuries, and I've never seen anything that made me believe in prophecies or fate or destiny. Until now. The admission hung between them like a confession, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. and Aaron felt something crack open in his chest at the vulnerability in her voice. She was offering him everything: justice for his people, alliance between their species, and something that might be the beginning of everything he'd never dared to dream of. She was taking a risk that could destroy her politically, could leave her vulnerable to challenges from within her own ranks. And she was doing it because she believed in the possibility of something better than the world they'd inherited. But before Aaron could respond, the moment was shattered by the sound of slow, mocking applause echoing through the chamber like a death knell. From the shadows at the far end of the platform stepped a figure that made every supernatural present go rigid with sudden alarm. An ancient vampire whose very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air and fill the space with the scent of old graves and forgotten deaths. "How touching," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of European nobility and the cold amusement of a predator watching prey stumble into a trap they'd set centuries in advance. "The little queen wants to play house with the puppies. Tell me, child, do you truly think that centuries of hatred can be overcome by pretty speeches and romantic notions?" Jane went deadly still, every muscle in her body tensing as her fangs descended and her eyes blazed with crimson fire. "Lucius," she hissed, the name carrying enough venom to kill a mortal man. "You dare show yourself in my territory?" The ancient vampire smiled, revealing fangs that seemed to glow with their own malevolent light. Lucius Blackheart was a legend among their kind, a creature so old and powerful that even other vampires spoke of him in whispers when they thought no one was listening. He'd been ancient when Jane was still human, had ruled the European courts for over 2 millennia before disappearing into the shadows to pursue his own mysterious agenda. "Your territory?" Lucius laughed, the sound like breaking glass and shattering dreams. "Child, I was walking these paths when this city was nothing but swampland and savage dreams. You rule here only because I allow it, and that allowance is about to expire." His presence filled the chamber with malevolent energy that made the emergency lighting flicker and dance, and Aaron felt his pack tense around him as their supernatural senses cataloged this new threat and found it far more dangerous than anything they'd previously encountered. This wasn't just another vampire. This was an apex predator that had survived for thousands of years by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everything that had ever challenged him. The power radiating from his frame was like standing too close to a nuclear reactor, overwhelming and dangerous, and carrying the promise of destruction for anyone foolish enough to oppose him. But it was the way Jane's entire demeanor changed that truly alarmed Aaron. Gone was the regal confidence he'd been admiring, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear mixed with desperate determination. Whatever history existed between Jane and this ancient monster, it was nothing good. "The old ways are dying, Lucius," Jane said, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from every line of her body. "The world has changed, and we must change with it or risk exposure and extinction. Alliance with the werewolves offers us a chance at survival in a new age where humans have satellites and genetic testing and ways of tracking us that our ancestors never imagined." Lucius waved a dismissive hand, his ancient eyes fixed on Aaron with predatory interest that made the werewolf's skin crawl. "Survival through submission, you mean? Bowing and scraping before these mongrels, begging for their acceptance like some lovesick mortal who's forgotten what she is. You disgust me, child. You've forgotten what it means to be vampire, forgotten the power that runs in your veins and the superiority that is our birthright." The insult to Jane sent a surge of protective fury through Aaron that surprised him with its intensity. His wolf snarled and paced, demanding that he defend the vampire queen from this ancient threat, and Aaron found himself taking a step forward despite every tactical consideration that said he should stay out of their internal politics. "She hasn't forgotten anything," Aaron said, his voice carrying the authority of his alpha position and the barely controlled fury of his wolf. "She's simply evolved beyond the mindless bloodlust that you represent. She's chosen to be something more than a parasite feeding on the innocent." Lucius turned his attention to Aaron with obvious amusement, his head tilted to one side as if examining an interesting specimen. The mongrel speaks. How delightful. Tell me, pup, do you truly think you can protect her from me? Do you understand what you're facing when you look at me? The challenge was unmistakable, and Aaron felt his pack shift behind him, ready to follow him into battle against impossible odds. But before he could respond, Jane stepped between them, her body language screaming protective fury as she faced down the ancient vampire who had once been her sire's master. Enough, she commanded, her voice echoing with supernatural power that made the very air tremble around them. This is my territory, Lucius, and these are my guests. You will show proper respect or face the consequences of your arrogance. What followed was unlike anything Aaron had ever witnessed in his decades of supernatural conflicts. Jane and Lucius circled each other with the deadly grace of apex predators, their supernatural auras clashing like opposing weather fronts and filling the chamber with enough tension to make the emergency lighting flicker and dance. The very air seemed to crackle with energy as two ancient powers prepared to test themselves against each other. When they finally came together, it was with violence that defied description. Ancient vampire fought ancient vampire with speed and strength that turned them into blurs of motion. Their battle ranging across the platform and up the walls as they defied gravity and physics in their struggle for dominance. Fangs and claws met in showers of sparks, and the sound of their conflict echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across the sky. Aaron watched in fascination and growing alarm as Jane held her own against an opponent who should have been able to destroy her without breaking a sweat. She was magnificent in her fury, a warrior queen defending her domain with every ounce of skill and power at her disposal. Her movements were liquid poetry, deadly and beautiful, and absolutely mesmerizing to watch. But even as he admired her fighting abilities, Aaron could see that she was being slowly overwhelmed, that Lucius's superior age and experience were beginning to tell despite her courage and determination. That was when Aaron made the decision that would change the course of supernatural history forever. Ignoring the startled protests of his pack, he shifted into his wolf form and launched himself into the battle, his massive frame intercepting Lucius's killing blow just as the ancient vampire was about to deliver it to Jane's exposed throat. The impact sent all three of them tumbling across the platform in a tangle of fangs and claws and supernatural fury. Aaron's wolf was enormous, nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and weighing close to 300 pounds of solid muscle and bone. His coat was midnight black with silver highlights that caught the emergency lighting, and his eyes burned like twin golden suns in the darkness. When he snarled, the sound echoed through the chamber like thunder, and his very presence seemed to make the air itself vibrate with primal power. Interesting, Lucius murmured as he extracted himself from the tangle with fluid grace, studying Aaron's wolf form with genuine curiosity. The pup has teeth after all. Tell me, mongrel, why do you defend a creature that should be your natural enemy? What possible motivation could drive you to risk your life for a vampire? Aaron shifted back to human form, his chest heaving with exertion and his eyes still blazing with golden fire that spoke of barely controlled rage. Because she's not my enemy, he said simply, the truth of the words resonating through the chamber like a bell tolling. And because some things are more important than ancient hatreds that no one alive today had any part in creating. Jane stared at him with an expression of wonder and something that might have been love beginning to bloom in her ancient heart. Her undead heart was attempting to beat for the first time in 9 centuries as she realized what his intervention meant. He had chosen to protect her over the safety of his own pack, had violated every law and tradition of his people to stand at her side against a threat that could destroy them all. How romantic, Lucius said with mock appreciation, but his ancient eyes held a new calculation that suggested he was reassessing the situation with fresh interest. The mongrel loves the monster. Tell me, children, do you understand what you have started here? Do you comprehend the forces you are attempting to unleash upon an unsuspecting world? But before either of them could respond, the chamber filled with the sound of howling wind and the scent of ozone that preceded supernatural storms. The air itself seemed to thicken and swirl around them, and Aaron felt his wolf recognize something ancient and powerful approaching with the inevitability of fate itself. The figure that materialized from the swirling energy wasn't what any of them had expected. She appeared to be an elderly woman, small and frail-looking, with silver hair that seemed to glow with its own inner light and eyes that held the depth of centuries. But the power that radiated from her diminutive frame was unmistakable, and every supernatural present dropped to their knees in unconscious recognition of authority that transcended species and politics. "Grandmother," Jane whispered, her voice filled with shock and wonder as she recognized the ancient figure who had taught her the old ways and the older magics. "But you're supposed to be dead. You died over 300 years ago." The old woman raised a hand for silence, her gaze moving from Jane to Aaron to Lucius with ancient wisdom that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the very souls beneath. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy and the certainty of fate itself, echoing strangely in the chamber as if spoken by multiple voices across multiple dimensions. "Death is simply another beginning, child," she said with a smile that held infinite compassion and understanding. "The time of choosing has come. The blood moon rises, the ancient words stir, and love stands ready to triumph over hatred for the first time in 10,000 years. But the choice must be made freely, children. The future cannot be forced. It must be embraced by those brave enough to reach for it." Aaron felt something stir in his memory, fragments of old songs his grandmother had sung when he was still a pup learning about his heritage. Words about wolves and vampires and love that conquered death itself. Prophecies that spoke of a time when natural enemies would become something more than allies. Jane seemed to be experiencing similar recognition, her eyes wide with wonder as she stared at the ancient figure who had vanished from her life centuries ago. "The prophecy," Jane breathed, understanding flooding her features like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. "It's not just legend, is it? It's happening now, right here in this forgotten place beneath the city." The old woman smiled, and for a moment the chamber filled with warmth and light that pushed back the shadows and made everything seem possible. "The prophecy was never about predicting the future, child. It was about creating the conditions for the future to choose itself. You and Aaron are not bound by destiny. You are destiny choosing to bind itself to something greater than the sum of its parts." Lucius snarled and stepped forward, his ancient features twisted with fury and disbelief that bordered on madness. "Impossible. The prophecy is children's nonsense, stories told to comfort the weak and the foolish who can't accept the harsh realities of existence. Vampires and werewolves are natural enemies, locked in eternal conflict by our very natures. We cannot love. We can only hunt and be hunted until one side or the other achieves final victory." But the old woman turned her gaze on him with such compassion that even the ancient vampire seemed to deflate beneath its weight. "Oh, my old friend," she said sadly, her voice carrying the kind of infinite patience that only came with true wisdom. "You have lived so long with hatred that you have forgotten what it feels like to hope for something better. Love is not weakness, Lucius. Love is the strongest force in any universe. The one power that can transform the very nature of reality itself." And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the old woman began to fade, her form becoming translucent as the supernatural energies that had brought her started to dissipate back into whatever realm they had come from. But her voice remained clear and strong as she delivered her final message to the assembled supernaturals. "The choice is yours, children. Love or hatred. Unity or division. A future written in blood or a future written in hope. Choose wisely, for the fate of all your peoples hangs in the balance of this moment." As her presence faded completely, leaving only the scent of old roses and the memory of infinite compassion, the chamber fell into absolute silence that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Aaron and Jane stared at each other across the space that separated them, both understanding that everything had changed, that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of the supernatural world. The weight of destiny pressed down on them like a physical thing, demanding that they choose between the hatred their peoples had always known and the love that seemed impossible but felt more real than anything either of them had ever experienced. Lucius stood frozen in place, his ancient features cycling through emotions that he hadn't felt in millennia as he grappled with the implications of what he had witnessed. Around them, vampires and werewolves watched in stunned silence, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be spoken of in legend for generations to come. It was Aaron who broke the silence, taking a step toward Jane with his hand extended and his heart blazing in his eyes like a beacon in the darkness. "I choose love," he said simply, his voice carrying absolute conviction that resonated through every corner of the chamber. "I choose unity over division, hope over fear. I choose you, Jane Nightfall, whatever the consequences may be for either of us." Jane stared at his outstretched hand for a moment that seemed to last forever, her mind racing through 9 centuries of existence and all the hatred and violence and loneliness that had defined her immortal life. She thought of the enemies she had made, the blood she had spilled, the darkness she had embraced in order to survive in a world that wanted her dead. Then she looked into Aaron's eyes and saw not condemnation but acceptance, not fear but wonder, not hatred but the promise of something she had never dared to dream possible. With movements as fluid as water, she placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of living flesh against her cold skin and the electric shock of connection that seemed to transform the very air around them. "I choose love as well," she said, her voice strong and clear and filled with wonder at the words coming from her own lips. "I choose you, Aaron Blackstone, and I choose the future we can build together if we're brave enough to reach for it." The moment their hands touched, something extraordinary happened that would be remembered and retold for centuries. The chamber filled with light, not the harsh glare of artificial illumination, but warm, golden radiance that seemed to emanate from their joined hands and spread outward like ripples on a pond. Every supernatural present felt it wash over them, a wave of power and possibility that spoke of fundamental change in the very nature of their world. The light was alive, pulsing with energy that resonated in harmony with both their heartbeats, his strong and steady, hers attempting to remember how to beat after centuries of stillness. It carried with it images and sensations that filled their minds with visions of what could be. Vampire and werewolf children playing together without fear, ancient enemies working side by side to protect the innocent, a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Even Lucius seemed affected by the display, his ancient features softening as he stared at the couple with something that might have been wonder or regret, or perhaps the first stirrings of hope he had felt in centuries of existence. "It's true," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and something that sounded almost like relief. "The prophecy is true. Love really can triumph over hatred, even hatred as old and deep as ours." As the light continued to grow and spread, filling the abandoned subway station with warmth and promise that chased away centuries of darkness, Aaron and Jane stood hand in hand at the center of it all. They were no longer Alpha and Vampire Queen, no longer natural enemies locked in eternal conflict, but something new and unprecedented, partners in the truest sense, mates chosen by fate and sealed by love, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The transformation didn't happen overnight, of course. There were centuries of hatred to overcome, traditions to reshape, and enemies on both sides who saw their alliance as an abomination that threatened the natural order of things. The younger members of both species struggled to accept what their leaders were asking of them, while the older ones clung to the familiar patterns of conflict and distrust that had defined their existence for millennia. But with each passing day, the bond between Aaron and Jane grew stronger, and their vision of a united future became more real, more tangible, more achievable. They began by establishing joint patrols that protected humans from supernatural threats, while respecting the feeding needs of vampires who chose to hunt ethically. They created councils where werewolves and vampires could address disputes without resorting to violence, developing new laws that protected both species while ensuring that innocent humans were never again victimized by either side. The blood moon that had witnessed their first meeting became a symbol of their alliance. And as months turned to years, other supernatural communities began to take notice of what was happening on the East Coast. Witches emerged from hiding to offer their support, recognizing that the alliance between vampires and werewolves might create space for their own people to step out of the shadows. Shapeshifters came forward to request inclusion in the growing coalition, and even some human authorities quietly reached out to establish diplomatic relations with the supernatural world. But it was the love story at the center of it all that truly captured imaginations and changed hearts. Aaron and Jane became legend even in their own lifetimes, proof that the deepest hatreds could be overcome by understanding and compassion, that enemies could become lovers, and that love really was the strongest force in any universe. Their relationship became a beacon of hope for others who had been told that certain things were impossible, that some barriers could never be crossed. The first major test of their alliance came when a rogue pack of werewolves in the Midwest began hunting vampires indiscriminately, killing both the guilty and the innocent in a campaign of vengeance that threatened to reignite the ancient war between their species. Aaron and Jane responded by sending a joint task force to deal with the situation. Werewolves and vampires working together to bring the rogues to justice and demonstrate that their alliance was more than just pretty words and good intentions. The mission was a success, but it came at a cost. 3 vampires and 2 werewolves died in the fighting, and their sacrifice became a powerful symbol of what their peoples were willing to give up in order to build something better than the world they had inherited. The funeral service, held under the light of a full moon in a neutral location that had once been a battlefield between their kinds, drew representatives from supernatural communities across the continent. Aaron and Jane stood together at the podium, sharing the duty of eulogizing the fallen warriors who had given their lives for a cause larger than themselves. They died as they lived, Aaron said, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled crowd. Not as vampires or werewolves, but as guardians protecting the innocent from those who would prey upon them. Their sacrifice reminds us that the price of peace is eternal vigilance, and that some things are worth dying for. Jane's words were equally powerful, her voice thick with emotion as she spoke of the vampires who had chosen duty over safety. They could have remained in their comfortable lairs, feeding on the willing and avoiding all conflict. Instead, they chose to stand with their former enemies in defense of justice and the rule of law. Their example will inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, unity over division. The months that followed saw a rapid expansion of their alliance as more and more supernatural communities requested inclusion in what was becoming known as the Covenant of Coexistence. Aaron and Jane found themselves traveling constantly, negotiating treaties and establishing protocols that would allow different species to interact safely and productively. They mediated disputes between ancient rivals, established trade agreements that benefited all parties, and slowly but surely built the framework for a truly integrated supernatural society. Their wedding, when it finally took place, was the event of the century in supernatural circles. Held on the anniversary of their first meeting in that abandoned subway station, now transformed into a memorial and museum dedicated to the Supernatural Peace Accords, it was attended by representatives from every supernatural community on the continent. The ceremony itself was conducted by the mysterious old woman who had appeared that first night, revealed now to be neither vampire nor werewolf, but something far older and more powerful. A guardian of the ancient magics who had waited centuries for the prophecy to fulfill itself. By the power vested in me, by forces older than civilization itself, she intoned as Aaron and Jane stood hand in hand before the assembled witnesses. I pronounce you not just husband and wife, but partners in the great work of transformation that will reshape our world for generations to come. The vows they exchanged were written by both of them, blending the traditions of their separate peoples into something entirely new. Aaron spoke first, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber and beyond, broadcast live to supernatural communities around the world who were watching history being made. "I take you as my mate," he said, his golden eyes never leaving Jane's face. "Not just as the woman I love beyond all reason, but as the partner who will help me build a future where all our children, vampire and werewolf and human alike, can live without fear, without hatred, without the constant threat of war hanging over their heads like a sword." Jane's response came with tears streaming down her face, the first tear she had shed in 9 centuries of existence. "I take you as my eternal companion," she said, her voice strong despite her emotion. "As the man who showed me that love is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. As the leader who will stand beside me, as we forge a new world from the ashes of the old. A world where love truly conquers all." When they kissed, sealing their union and their alliance, the chamber filled once again with that golden light, and every person present felt the weight of history shifting around them like tectonic plates finding new alignment. The supernatural world would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. But their greatest challenge was yet to come. 6 months after their wedding, as their alliance grew stronger and more supernatural communities joined their cause, they received word that the old vampire courts of Europe had declared them enemies of the natural order. Led by ancient creatures who made Lucius look young by comparison, a massive force was gathering across the Atlantic to destroy what they saw as an abomination against the fundamental laws of supernatural existence. "They're calling it a crusade," Derek reported as he stood before Aaron and Jane in their joint command center, a converted warehouse that served as headquarters for their growing alliance. His expression was grim as he laid out intelligence reports that painted a picture of unprecedented supernatural mobilization. "The European ancients have convinced the old families that your union represents an existential threat to vampire supremacy. They're mobilizing every ancient bloodline in Europe, calling in favors that go back centuries." Jane studied the intelligence reports with the calculating gaze of a military strategist, her mind already working through the tactical implications of facing an enemy force that included some of the oldest and most powerful vampires in existence. "How many?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "Conservative estimates put it at over 300, Derek replied grimly, his scarred hands clenching and unclenching as he spoke. "But these aren't ordinary vampires, Jane. These are ancients, creatures that predate recorded history. Some of them are older than written language, older than the pyramids. They have power you can't imagine, abilities that predate modern magic and defy everything we think we know about supernatural limitations." Aaron moved to stand behind his mate, his hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture of support and solidarity that had become second nature to both of them. "Let them come," he said with the kind of quiet confidence that had made him a legend among his own people. "We've proven that unity makes us stronger than we ever were apart. Whatever they bring against us, we'll face it together." But Jane shook her head, her expression troubled as she continued to study the reports. "You don't understand, my love. These aren't just powerful vampires. They're the architects of our species' darkest traditions, the creatures who first established the laws that made vampires and werewolves natural enemies. They have power that transcends individual strength, magic that can reshape reality itself. Some of them are said to have been present at the creation of our species, to have drunk from the source of all vampiric power. The war that followed would later be known as the Night of Burning Skies, when ancient magics clashed over the Atlantic Ocean and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist under the strain of supernatural forces unleashed without restraint. The European ancients came across the ocean like a force of nature, their ships cutting through the waves with unnatural speed, while storms of their own making cleared the seas before them and shrouded their approach in supernatural darkness. Aaron and Jane had gathered every ally they could find for the coming conflict. Werewolf packs from across North America answered the call, as did vampire covens that had embraced their vision of coexistence. Witch circles that had remained hidden for centuries emerged from their covens to lend their power to the cause, and shapeshifter clans offered their unique abilities to the growing alliance. Even some human military units, secretly briefed on the supernatural world and its conflicts, provided logistical support and advanced weaponry. Their combined forces numbered in the thousands, but both Aaron and Jane knew that numbers alone would not be enough against enemies who had perfected the art of war before human civilization had learned to forge iron. These were creatures who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who had shaped the course of history from the shadows, who possessed knowledge and power that had been accumulating for millennia. The first battle took place on the rocky coast of Maine, where the European advance forces made landfall under cover of darkness and fog so thick it seemed solid. The very air itself felt wrong, charged with supernatural energy that made mortal technology malfunction and caused even experienced warriors to feel a deep, primal unease that spoke of powers beyond their understanding. Aaron led the werewolf packs in their wolf forms, massive creatures that moved like liquid shadows through the supernatural mist that had rolled in with the enemy forces. His own wolf was magnificent even among such company, nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and radiating an aura of alpha dominance that made even ancient vampires take notice. When he howled, calling his forces to battle, the sound echoed across the water like a challenge to the gods themselves. Jane commanded her vampires with a tactical brilliance that had made her a legend among her own kind, coordinating strikes and withdrawals with precision that turned the chaotic battlefield into a deadly chess game. She had traded her elegant gowns for practical combat gear that allowed for unrestricted movement while still managing to look regal even in the midst of supernatural warfare. The fighting that followed was unlike anything the modern world had ever seen, a clash of powers that belonged more to myth and legend than to contemporary reality. Ancient vampires wielded magics that turned the very air into weapons, creating whirlwinds of force that could shred steel and stone with equal ease. Werewolves called upon primal forces that made the earth itself shake with rage, their howls summoning storms, and their presence awakening ancient spirits that had slept beneath the land for centuries. Spells that had been forbidden for millennia lit the night sky like falling stars, and the clash of supernatural auras created aurora-like displays that could be seen from orbit. The battle raged across land and sea and sky, with participants moving at speeds that defied human perception and striking with force that could level buildings. But it was when Aaron and Jane fought side by side against the enemy leaders that the tide of battle truly began to turn. Working in perfect coordination despite having known each other for less than 2 years, they moved like dancers performing a routine they had practiced for centuries. Where Aaron's raw power and tactical brilliance created openings, Jane's speed and supernatural abilities exploited them with surgical precision. The enemy had expected to face divided forces, vampires and werewolves who would be hampered by mistrust and competing agendas. Instead, they found themselves confronting a united front that combined the best qualities of both species while minimizing their individual weaknesses. The psychological impact was devastating. These ancient creatures had lived through enough conflicts to recognize when they were facing something genuinely new and dangerous. The decisive moment came when they faced the true leader of the European forces, an ancient vampire so old that his name had been forgotten by history, a creature who claimed to have been present at the very birth of their species. He was power incarnate, radiating an aura of malevolence that made reality itself seem to warp and bend around his presence. "You children play with forces beyond your comprehension," he said, his voice carrying the weight of millennia and the certainty of ultimate victory. "Love is a mortal weakness, a fantasy that has no place among creatures such as ourselves. You will learn the futility of your alliance when I tear it apart piece by piece." But Aaron and Jane had learned something during their months together that their enemy could never understand. That love wasn't just an emotion, but a source of power, a force that could literally transform the nature of reality when wielded by those who truly understood its potential. Standing hand in hand as the ancient monster approached, they spoke words in perfect unison, their voices blending into something that resonated with harmonic frequencies that seemed to reach into the very foundations of existence. By the power of love freely given, they chanted, golden light beginning to emanate from their joined hands. By the strength of unity chosen over division, by the courage to choose hope over hatred, we bind you to face the truth you have spent eternity denying. The spell that erupted from their combined will was unlike anything any of the combatants had ever witnessed. It struck the ancient vampire like a tsunami of pure force. But instead of destroying him, it forced him to confront something he had buried so deep within himself that he had forgotten it existed. His own capacity for love, for connection, for something beyond the endless hunger that had defined his existence for millennia. The transformation was visible to everyone present as the ancient creature fell to his knees, his face cycling through emotions he hadn't felt since he was mortal. Memories flooded back of a time before vampirism, when he had been human and capable of love, when he had chosen the darkness not out of evil, but out of despair at losing everything he had ever cared about. I remember, he whispered, tears of blood streaming down his face as centuries of accumulated pain and loneliness came pouring out. I remember what it was like to hope, to dream, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. How did I forget? How did I let the darkness consume everything good that I once was? The battle ended not with violence, but with understanding, as one by one the European forces laid down their arms and considered for the first time in centuries that perhaps there was another way to exist than an eternal conflict. The ancient surrender sent ripples through the supernatural world that would be felt for generations, proving that even the oldest hatreds could be overcome by those brave enough to choose love over fear. The peace negotiations that followed took place in neutral territory, a monastery in the Swiss Alps that had been abandoned for centuries but still held the echo of prayers and holy aspirations. The location was chosen specifically for its symbolic value, a place where different faiths had once coexisted in harmony, where humans had dedicated their lives to ideals larger than themselves. Representatives from every supernatural community in the world gathered to draft what would become known as the Covenant of Eternal Peace, a document that would establish the legal framework for coexistence between all supernatural species and their human neighbors. The negotiations were intense, sometimes heated, as centuries of mistrust and competing interests had to be addressed and resolved. Aaron and Jane served as co-chairs of the historic gathering, their love story serving as both inspiration and proof that the seemingly impossible could become reality. When disagreements arose, and they did frequently and passionately, it was their example that reminded everyone present that compromise and understanding were not signs of weakness, but evidence of the strength that came from choosing cooperation over conflict. The document they eventually produced was a masterpiece of diplomatic language and practical governance, establishing everything from feeding protocols that protected human rights to dispute resolution mechanisms that could prevent minor disagreements from escalating into wars. It created the framework for a truly integrated supernatural society while respecting the autonomy and traditions of individual communities. The signing ceremony took place exactly 1 year after their first meeting, with representatives from over 50 supernatural communities putting their names to a document that would reshape the world. But it was the final signatures that carried the most symbolic weight. Aaron Blackstone, Alpha of the Eastern Seaboard Pack, and Jane Nightfall, Queen of the Eastern Vampire Collective, signing not just as leaders, but as partners in every sense of the word. As they stood together before the assembled delegates, their hands intertwined and their hearts beating in synchrony despite the fundamental differences in their natures, Aaron spoke words that would be quoted for generations to come. Today we prove that love is stronger than hatred, that unity is stronger than division, and that the future belongs to those brave enough to choose hope over fear. We are no longer werewolves and vampires, predators and prey. natural enemies locked in eternal conflict. We are partners, allies, and above all, we are family. Jane's response was equally powerful, her voice carrying to every corner of the ancient monastery and beyond, broadcast to supernatural communities around the world who were watching history being made. "The old world dies today," she said, her crimson eyes blazing with hope and determination that seemed to light up the entire chamber. "The world of shadows and secrets, of hunting and being hunted, of children growing up knowing only hatred for those who are different from themselves. In its place, we birth a new world, a world where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where our children will know peace instead of war, where love truly conquers all." The transformation of the supernatural world that followed didn't happen overnight, but it was faster and more comprehensive than anyone had dared to hope. Within 5 years, the Alliance had expanded to include virtually every supernatural community on Earth, creating a global network of cooperation and mutual support that had never existed before in recorded history. They established the Institute for Supernatural Cooperation, a combination university and research facility where young vampires and werewolves learned alongside each other, studying not just their own abilities, but the sciences and arts that would help them integrate into the broader world. The curriculum included everything from advanced physics and computer science to philosophy and literature, preparing students for careers in both the supernatural and human worlds. They created the Supernatural Council, a governing body with representatives from every known supernatural species, which worked with human governments to address issues of mutual concern. The council served as both legislature and court, creating laws that protected all species while providing mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence. Most importantly, they began adopting children, not biological children, which remained impossible given their different natures, but orphaned children from both communities who grew up knowing love instead of hatred, unity instead of division. These children became the first generation of truly integrated supernatural citizens, equally comfortable in vampire courts and werewolf dens, speaking the languages of both peoples and understanding instinctively that their differences made them stronger rather than weaker. The success of their experiment inspired similar changes throughout the supernatural world. Couples began forming across species lines with increasing frequency. Vampire and witch, werewolf and shapeshifter, human and supernatural. The old taboos crumbled as people realized that love truly did transcend the arbitrary boundaries that had been established by fear and tradition. But perhaps the greatest testament to their love story was the change it inspired in the human world as well. As supernatural beings began emerging from the shadows and integrating into human society, they brought with them knowledge and abilities that revolutionized everything from medicine to environmental science. Vampire longevity research led to breakthroughs in aging and disease prevention, while werewolf connection to nature provided insights into sustainable living and ecological balance. The revelation of the supernatural world to humanity, when it finally came, was managed carefully and gradually through the Council's cooperation with world governments. Rather than the panic and violence that many had feared, the disclosure led to a period of unprecedented cooperation and discovery as humanity learned that they were not alone in the universe and that their supernatural neighbors had been protecting them for centuries. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Aaron and Jane returned to the abandoned subway station where it all began, now transformed into a memorial and museum dedicated to the supernatural peace accords. The space that had once echoed with the sounds of conflict now rang with the laughter of children from all species who came there on field trips to learn about the historic events that had shaped their world. As they stood in the same spot where they had first looked into each other's eyes and felt the stirring of impossible love, they reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. The chamber was filled with golden light now, not from supernatural sources, but from careful lighting design that honored the sacred nature of the space, while making it welcoming to visitors of all ages. "Do you ever regret it?" Aaron asked, his arm around his mate's waist as they watched vampire and werewolf children playing together in perfect harmony. Do you ever wonder what might have been if we had chosen differently that night? Jane leaned into his embrace, her cold skin somehow feeling warm against his touch, her undead heart somehow managing to beat in perfect rhythm with his living one. The question didn't require much consideration. She had never been more certain of anything in 9 centuries of existence. Never, she said without hesitation, her voice filled with the kind of absolute certainty that came from making the right choice and living with its consequences. We chose love over hatred, hope over fear, unity over division. We chose to believe that the world could be better than it was, and we made that belief a reality through our actions and our commitment to each other. How could I ever regret the greatest decision I've ever made? As they kissed in the golden light of the memorial chamber, surrounded by the sounds of children who would never know the hatred that had once defined their peoples, Aaron and Jane knew that they had done more than fall in love. They had literally transformed the nature of their world, proving that some bonds truly are stronger than death, stronger than tradition, and stronger than the accumulated weight of ancient history. The prophecy had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded even its most optimistic interpretations. But more than that, they had written a new prophecy with their lives, a promise to future generations that love would always triumph over hatred, that unity would always overcome division, and that those brave enough to choose hope over fear could literally change the world through the power of their commitment to something greater than themselves. And in the years that followed, as their love story became legend and their legacy spread to supernatural communities around the globe, Aaron Blackstone and Jane Nightfall became eternal proof that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones most worth fighting for, and that love truly is the strongest force in any universe, strong enough to transform enemies into allies, hatred into hope, and an ancient world of shadows into a bright future filled with infinite possibility. Their story ended where it began, with 2 souls recognizing their perfect match across an impossible divide, but also began where it ended, with the promise that love would continue to grow and spread and transform the world for generations yet to come. The blood moon prophecy had been fulfilled, but the real magic, the magic of love conquering all, was just beginning to reshape reality itself in ways that would echo through eternity. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel for more captivating audiobook stories that'll transport you to worlds beyond imagination. Your support means everything to creators like us who are passionate about bringing these magical stories to life. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart. Share it with fellow lovers of supernatural romance. And let us know in the comments what kind of mystical adventure you'd like to hear next.